The dust rose off the east road a full 10 minutes before the buggy crested the rise, and Wren Calder knew exactly what that dust meant before she ever saw a face behind it. She was on the porch, same as most afternoons, a tin bowl of dry beans balanced against her knee, and she didn't stop shelling them. 4 years on this porch had worn a hollow into the second step, where a boot always landed the same way. And she'd learned the sound of a stranger's wheels the way some people learn weather, by the way the air changed before anything else did. She was 26 that autumn. 5 years earlier, she'd been a mill girl in a town in lower Michigan, with soot in her hair, and $9 sewn into the lining of a coat 2 sizes too big for her. On a train headed toward a stretch of Nebraska territory she couldn't have pointed to on a map. 2 Forks, the depot sign said when she finally got there. She hadn't asked what the forks were or where the second one went. The buggy belonged to the loan office in Garner's Crossing, 26 miles east. She'd seen it twice before. Both times it had meant paper to sign and numbers to be doubted, and a man in a collar too clean for the ground he was walking on. She kept shelling. The pods split soft under her thumb, one after another, and behind her, through the open door, she heard her husband's boots cross the kitchen floor at the same unhurried pace he did everything. She'd have plenty of reason to remember, before that day was through, exactly what those 4 years had cost her and exactly what they'd bought. But that came later. First, there was a wagon to think about, and a Tuesday, cold as any Tuesday she could recall, back before any of this. The fence, the coffee cups, the mended step, had a name. 5 years back, February, a stockyard platform in Kiersey. Frost had silvered the fence posts that morning, thick enough to leave a white crust on her sleeve where she brushed against the rail. She stood at the end of a line of women, hands folded over her apron, watching the ranchers walk the row the way men walk a row of horses they're not sure they want. She was taller than most of the other women there by a head, her coat cut for someone smaller, sleeves riding up past her wrist bone. She had stopped expecting to be looked at the way the others were looked at, chin-tipped, eyes gone soft and waiting. She'd never learned to do that, and by 21 she'd stopped trying. The man who finally stopped in front of her was 38, cracked at the corners of his eyes from squinting into weather, wearing a coat mended at the elbow by a hand that clearly wasn't his own. He looked her over the way a man looks over a horse he's thinking of buying, not unkindly, just thorough, like he meant to get his money's worth out of the looking. "You look sturdy," he said. "I am," she told him. "I don't need a pretty wife." He said it plain, no apology folded into it. "I need one who won't fold up when the winter does its worst." "Can you keep a house through 6 weeks of bad road with no one to send for? Could you pull a calf if it came wrong and there was nobody else on the place?" She'd said yes to both. The second was a lie. She'd never so much as touched a calf in her life. But something had come up a half-inch in her chin when she said it, and Ansel Marsh, though he gave no sign of it then, noticed. That was the whole of the courting. His name and hers, on a paper the county clerk barely glanced at, and a wagon ride the next morning that ate up most of a day, the sky the flat gray of an old coin. The road frozen into ruts that threw her against the rail every quarter mile. She counted fence posts along the road to keep herself from counting the miles instead. 41 before he spoke again. "House is small," he said. "Roof sound, though?" She would learn over the coming years that this was as close as Ansel Marsh came to a love letter. If you'd told her then what 4 years on that homestead would come to mean, what a fence line and 2 coffee cups and a mended porch step could add up to, she wouldn't have believed a word of it. But stay with this one. It gets to something worth hearing. The first night and the ones after, there was no fire laid when they reached the house. She built one herself before she even shed her coat, because a woman who couldn't get a cold house warm had no business calling herself capable of the rest of it. Ansel came in from the barn an hour later, hat still on, and stood a long moment looking at the flames like they'd answered some question he hadn't said out loud. He didn't mention it. He never mentioned things like that. She'd learn later that not mentioning them was, for him, its own kind of answer. She slept that first stretch in the small room off the kitchen, and every morning she woke to the sound of him already gone out to the stock, and every morning there was coffee left warm on the stove. 2 cups poured. She never asked why 2. She drank from one and left the other, and by the third week he'd stopped pouring the second, and she noticed that the way you notice a held breath finally let go. That January the cold got into everything: the door hinges, the water bucket, the marrow of her own hands. She woke one morning to find the wash bucket frozen solid enough to hold a spoon upright, and broke the crust with the flat of her hand before she thought better of it. Ansel found her at the basin with her knuckles split and bleeding into the water, and he didn't ask why she hadn't woken him. He only walked out to the barn and came back with a hatchet, and after that there was always a hatchet hung by the bucket, and neither of them ever spoke of it again. That was the winter she learned the shape of him, not through anything said, but through what appeared. A second lamp wick when hers burned low. A patched glove on the peg where her torn one had hung the night before. Nothing announced. Nothing asked after. She'd believed that first year that a quiet man was a man with nothing much to say. By the time the snow broke in March, she understood she'd had it backward. He simply didn't waste words on things that could be shown instead. The step and the fence. The porch step cracked under her boot the second week, a groan of old wood, then a give, her ankle jarring hard against the frame before she caught the rail. She didn't say anything about it. She stepped around the soft board after that, the way a person learns to walk around a hazard they've quietly decided isn't worth naming out loud. He fixed it on a Tuesday. She came out at dusk to find fresh-cut wood laid flush against the old boards, the nails countersunk clean, the sawdust swept off to the side like it had never happened at all. He never told her he'd done it. She only found the difference under her own weight, solid now, no give, no complaint. "Steps fixed," she said at supper, not a question. "Was loose," he said, and passed her the bread, and that was the whole conversation. The fence came later, and it came the same way. She'd asked him, mild as she could manage, how many posts he meant to run before spring, because she wanted to know whether it was worth breaking ground for a garden past that first year, or whether she ought to plan on leaving when her year was up, the way some hired brides did once the worst of the winter proved too much. He'd gone quiet in that particular way of his, a stillness that meant he was turning something over rather than ignoring her, and said he'd get more wire from town on Tuesday. That had been the whole conversation. It had also, she came to understand only slowly, been him asking her to stay and her answering that she would. He started the fence line that same week, driving posts into ground still frozen hard enough to take 3 swings apiece to break the crust. She held wire for him without being asked, hands raw inside, gloves too thin for the work, and when he told her once, not looking at her. "Good hold there." It landed on her the way a compliment lands on someone who isn't used to getting them, sideways and harder than it should have. The last post went in near dusk, the sky gone the color of a bruise healing over. He'd stepped back to look at the line of it running straight to the tree break, hands on his hips, breath showing white in the cold. "Holds," he said. "Looks it," then slower than he needed to. "Good fence outlasts most things people build." She hadn't answered that. She'd only kept coiling the spare wire because moving her hands was easier than sitting still with what he'd almost said out loud. The fever winter. There was a boy for a while. Just shy of 2 winters old, with Ansel's stillness already showing in him and none of his mother's restlessness yet. She didn't like to walk through that season in her mind too often, but Thursdays had a way of dragging old ground up along with the new. He'd taken sick in late February, the kind of fever that climbed instead of breaking, and the nearest doctor was in Garner's Crossing, 26 miles of frozen road away. Ansel rode out into a hard sleet before first light without being asked, without more than a word to her at the door. Keep him wrapped. Keep the water in him. And she'd walked that porch half the night with the boy against her shoulder, counting his breaths the way she'd once counted fence posts. Because counting was the only thing that kept her hands from shaking. The doctor came back with Ansel near dawn, half frozen both of them, and stayed through the worst of it. And by the third day the fever broke and the boy slept the deep, boneless sleep of a child who'd fought something and won. Ansel hadn't said much through any of it. He'd only sat up 2 of those nights in the chair by the stove where she could see him from the small room, not sleeping, not needing to be asked to be there. She thought of that porch differently after that winter, not just as a place she swept and mended, but as ground she'd walked a fever off of inch by inch, with a man who hadn't once told her to go back to bed and let him handle it. He'd handled plenty. He'd also, without saying so, made it plain there was nothing on that place that was his to handle alone anymore. The boy grew past it fine, and was off at his uncle's place in Garner's Crossing that particular autumn, learning his letters for the season, which was its own quiet ache she didn't examine too closely most days. But she remembered the fever whenever the bank agent's kind of Thursday came around, because it reminded her that whatever a stranger with a ledger thought he understood about this ranch. He hadn't sat up 2 nights in a hard chair for it, and he never would. Present day. The porch again. 4 years on, that fence still ran the same straight gray line out to the tree break, patched twice where deer had come through hard one bad winter, holding all the same. She could see it most mornings from the porch rail, past Ansel's shoulder while he drank his coffee standing up, the way he always had. And some mornings she still found herself measuring the length of it with her eyes, the way another woman might turn a ring around her finger. Proof worn into the land instead of onto a hand. The step didn't creak anymore either. She tested it every morning anyway, out of a habit that had long since outlived its reason. Boot down, weight settling, nothing. Just wood doing what wood was supposed to do. Ansel came in from the barn that morning stamping frost off his boots, not looking at her directly, which was how he looked at most things that mattered to him. "Cold's coming in early," he said. "Ground'll be too hard for digging by week's end." "Won't need digging till spring," she said, and set his cup on the table without being asked. He took it without thanking her, and neither of those things was an absence of anything. It was simply how the house ran now, the way water finds its channel and quits arguing with the bank that holds it. 4 years back she'd have called this nothing, a cup, a step, a fence. She'd have said a marriage needed more to hang itself on than that. Some declaration, loud and plain, the kind her own mother had made a habit of, full of words and short on staying power. But she'd stood in this kitchen long enough now to understand the cup was the declaration. The fence was the declaration. She'd stopped waiting on the other kind sometime around the second winter without quite noticing the moment it happened. "Bank sent word," Ansel said, setting his cup down. "Man's coming Thursday about the note." She didn't look up from the stove. "The Garner note comes due end of the month. They want somebody out to look the place over before they'll renew it." "Never sent anybody before." "No," she agreed. "They haven't." He drank his coffee standing, the way he always did, and outside the window the first real light came up gold and thin over the fence line. Catching the new frost on every post he'd driven into that ground with his own hands, one bad-tempered winter at a time. She watched it a moment, then turned back to the stove, filing the news away the way she filed most things now, not urgent, not yet, just a fact laid quiet beside the others. Waiting to see what it would need from her. 3 days off yet. She scraped the pan and told herself she wouldn't wonder what a stranger might say about the woman standing in this kitchen. She told herself that for most of the 3 days, and it held up about as well as most things a person tells herself. Thursday, the wagon came up the road an hour before noon, wheels cutting soft through mud gone loose with the week's first thaw. She heard it before Ansel did, the particular creak of a rig built for town streets, oiled and unused to ruts like theirs. He was down at the fence line when it pulled into the yard, twisting a length of wire, and he didn't hurry to meet it. He finished the wire, set his pliers on the post, and only then started up toward the house, wiping his hands on his trousers in 2 short strokes. The agent stepped down careful, like the mud might hold opinions about his boots. He was narrow-built, a coat too clean for the season, and he looked at the barn roof and the fence and the new plank in the porch step before he looked at either of them straight on. 4 years since the last visit, he said, didn't expect to find it standing this square. Ground's the same ground, Ansel said. The agent laughed, a short sound with no real weather in it, and walked the porch steps, the one that didn't creak anymore. Hadn't creaked in 3 winters, and stood looking out over the fence line running clean to the tree break. Wren sat with the bean basket in her lap and kept working, hands moving the way they always moved, unhurried, the pods splitting soft under her thumbs. She felt his glance land on her once, the way a man assesses a piece of furniture nobody warned him about. He turned back to Ansel before he said anything more. "I'll say it plain," the agent told him. "I'm surprised you did as well as you did out here. A place this far out usually needs a proper wife behind it, Someone to keep the book straight, keep a man steady. You've managed some other way, I take it. What happened next wasn't anything either of them had planned for, and it wasn't anything Ansel Marsh would ever fully explain, not even years on. But it happened plain, right there on the porch, in front of a stranger who'd come to put a number on their whole life together. The porch went quiet enough that she heard the dog shift on the boards behind her. Ansel didn't look at the agent when he answered. He looked at her. "I've got exactly the wife I asked for." The words came out flat and unhurried, the way everything he said came out like a nail driven once and true. Then his hand came down over hers on the porch rail. Not a reach, not a question, just weight settling where it had always belonged. She went still. One breath held, then let go. The bean pod split under her thumb anyway, out of pure habit, and the halves dropped into the bowl, and she didn't look up, though something in her chest had gone entirely, dangerously quiet. The agent cleared his throat, the sound of a man recalculating a figure he'd already written down in ink. "Well," he said. That's good to hear." He shuffled the papers on his knee, though nothing on them had changed, and looked at the fence line and the mended gate and the new plank in the step as if seeing them fresh, needing somewhere else to put his eyes for a moment. "Numbers are sound," he said. "Renewal shouldn't give you any trouble." Ansel nodded once. His hand didn't move. She kept shelling beans. The pods came apart the way they always did, small green weight dropping into the bowl in her lap, and she didn't look at either man, though she could feel every place his fingers touched her skin. The way a person feels, whether changing before it's arrived in earnest. What the fence line couldn't say for itself. For years she'd lived on that porch. She'd scrubbed it, swept it, sat on its rail mending a boot in 100 different lights, walked a fevered child across its boards more nights than she liked to count. No one had ever laid a hand on her out here where the road could see it. Not once in 4 years. The agent gathered his papers and stood, said something about the season, about wanting to be back in town before dark. Ansel walked him to his horse. She heard their voices low across the yard, the creak of the saddle, the agent's boot finding the stirrup. And she sat with the bowl in her lap and didn't move until the hoofbeats had thinned out past the gate and the dust had settled back down over the fence posts. Then she looked at her own hand. It looked the same as it always had, broad across the knuckle, brown from the sun, a thin white scar along the thumb from a canning jar 3 winters back. It didn't look like a hand a man had chosen to lay his own over, in front of a stranger on purpose, without being asked to. Ansel came back across the yard slow, the way he did everything, and picked his cup up off the rail where he'd left it, and drank it though it had gone cold. "Beans'll be ready by supper," she said. "Good," he said, and neither of them said anything else for a while. The light was going long and gold across the fence line, the one he'd built the summer she'd said she'd stay, and somewhere past the barn a horse called out once and was answered. The last light. She finished shelling the beans before the light went fully. Her fingers knew the work without her watching them anymore, pod split, thumb run down the seam, the small hard weight of them dropping. 4 years of evenings just like this one. 4 years since a frozen platform in Kiersey, since a line of women standing in the cold with their hands folded. Since a man had walked the row and stopped in front of her and told her plainly what he needed, no apology folded into it anywhere. She'd married a man who wanted a strong wife. She hadn't asked him, not once in all that time, whether he'd found one worth wanting for anything past that. She hadn't needed to ask, not anymore. He'd answered it that afternoon, on a porch in front of a stranger with a ledger, without even raising his voice to do it. The bowl was full. She set it on the step beside her, the one he'd fixed her first week here, the board that no longer gave under weight. Ansel stood a little way off, cup in hand, looking out at the fence line the way he looked at most things. Steady, unhurried, like the looking itself was a kind of work worth finishing properly. "That agent'll be back come spring," he said. "Same fool questions. Let him ask them," she said. He almost smiled. She caught the corner of it and looked away before it could turn into something she'd have to answer out loud. The horse called again from past the barn, and this time the other one answered nearer, low and unbothered, ordinary sounds, the kind that had come over 4 winters. To mean the day was closing out without trouble in it. She'd learned that wasn't a small thing to be able to say about a day. Not out here, not on ground like this. She thought of the two coffee cups sitting side by side on the rail that morning, before either of them had known what the day would ask of them. She thought of his hand, flat and warm over hers, for exactly as long as it takes to say a true thing without needing to say it in so many words. She picked the bowl back up. There was supper yet to get to, and beans didn't cook themselves, and tomorrow there'd be the sagging corner of fence to look at, and the roan mare favoring her left foreleg since Tuesday. The ranch didn't stop needing them, just because a man from a bank had come and gone with his papers. She rose, and the step held the way it always held now, sure under her boot, and she went in to start the stove. Behind her, Ansel stayed a while longer on the porch, his cup empty, watching the fence line go from gold to gray to the color of nothing at all, and he didn't follow her in until the last of the light was gone from it. And the two cups on the rail sat catching whatever was left of the evening between them. So that's the story, a marriage that never once needed loud words to prove it was real. Just a fence built the day she agreed to stay, a hatchet hung by a frozen bucket, and a hand laid over hers when a stranger needed telling. If you'd been on that porch, if you'd spent 4 years being underestimated by everyone who rode up that road, would you have wanted the loud declaration? Or would the fence line have been enough for you? Let me know down in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and what you'd have done in Ren's place. And if this one got you somewhere, hit like, subscribe if you haven't yet, and stick around. There's more where this came from.